The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Yet somehow Jessica found herself stepping forward anyway. "I dare you to kiss me," Michelle had said, her voice barely above a whisper, and now they were frozen in this moment where everything could change. Jessica's heart hammered against her ribs as she searched Michelle's face for any sign of jest, any indication that this was just another one of their late-night conversations that pushed boundaries without meaning to. But Michelle's eyes held something different tonight, something that made Jessica's breath catch in her throat. The golden light from the lamp cast shadows across Michelle's features, highlighting the curve of her lips, the way her chest rose and fell with each careful breath. "Michelle?" Jessica whispered, her voice cracking slightly on the name she'd spoken 1,000 times before, but never like this. Never with her heart threatening to burst from her chest, never with the weight of 2 years and 4 months of hidden longing pressing against her lungs like a physical thing. Michelle's hand reached up, fingers trembling as they traced the line of Jessica's jaw. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," she admitted, and Jessica felt the world tilt on its axis. "About you. About us. About why every relationship I've ever had felt like I was playing a role in someone else's story." The confession hit Jessica like a physical blow, stealing what little breath she had left. She had spent so many nights lying awake, cataloging every glance, every touch, every moment that might have meant something more, only to dismiss them all as wishful thinking. But now Michelle was looking at her like she held the answer to every question she'd been too afraid to ask. "How long?" Michelle's voice was so soft Jessica almost missed it. "How long have you felt this way about me?" The question hung between them, demanding honesty that Jessica had spent years avoiding. She thought of all the times she'd listened to Michelle complain about boyfriends who didn't understand her, all the times she'd offered advice while her own heart broke a little more with each word. She thought of the way Michelle's laugh could light up an entire room, how she unconsciously moved closer during their movie nights, how she'd started seeking Jessica out first whenever she had news to share. 2 years and 4 months, Jessica whispered, the admission falling from her lips like a prayer. "Since that night you showed up at my door crying about Tyler and I realized I would do anything to make you smile again. Since I understood that every piece of relationship advice I gave you was really just me telling you what I wished I could say myself." Michelle's eyes fluttered closed, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "God, Jessica, I've been so blind, so incredibly blind." Her thumb brushed across Jessica's cheekbone, and Jessica leaned into the touch like a flower turning toward the sun. "All those times I complained about feeling disconnected, about something being missing. It was you. It was always you." But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, suspended between their old life and whatever came next, one would have to go back to the beginning, to 3 months earlier when everything had seemed so much simpler and so much more complicated all at once. Jessica had been curled up on her couch with a book and a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold when the frantic knocking started. She knew immediately that it was Michelle, could recognize the particular rhythm of her friend's impatience even through the thick wooden door. Setting her book aside with a sigh that was equal parts fond exasperation and genuine concern, Jessica padded to the door in her socks and oversized sweater. Michelle stood in the hallway looking like she'd dressed in the dark, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy bun that suggested she'd been running her hands through it, her eyes red-rimmed and slightly wild. She held a bottle of wine in one hand and what appeared to be a bag of takeout containers in the other, and Jessica's heart did that familiar flutter it always did when Michelle showed up unannounced, seeking comfort and companionship. "Tyler is an absolute moron," Michelle announced without preamble, pushing past Jessica into the apartment with the kind of casual familiarity that came from 3 years of friendship. "I mean, a complete and utter waste of oxygen. I don't know why I ever thought dating him was a good idea." Jessica closed the door and followed Michelle into the living room, watching as her friend set the wine and food on the coffee table with perhaps more force than necessary. This was familiar territory, the ritual they'd developed over the months of Michelle's on-and-off relationship with Tyler Kim. Jessica would listen, offer tissues and wine and carefully neutral advice, and try to ignore the way her chest tightened every time Michelle talked about trying to make things work with yet another man who clearly didn't appreciate what he had. "What did he do this time?" Jessica asked, settling back onto the couch and making room for Michelle beside her. She already knew she'd spend the evening being the perfect supportive friend, helping Michelle process her feelings while carefully burying her own. Michelle flopped down next to her with a dramatic sigh, immediately gravitating toward Jessica's warmth in that unconscious way that had been slowly driving Jessica insane for months. "He forgot our anniversary. Not just forgot to plan something special, forgot entirely. When I mentioned it, he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language." She reached for the wine bottle, struggling with the cork for a moment before Jessica gently took it from her hands. 3 months isn't really that significant an anniversary," Jessica offered carefully as she opened the wine, though privately she thought that anyone dating Michelle should consider every day with her worth celebrating. Maybe he just doesn't think in those terms. "That's not the point," Michelle said, accepting the glass Jessica handed her and taking a generous sip. "It's not about the anniversary itself, it's about the fact that I told him it mattered to me and he didn't care enough to remember. It's about the fact that I feel like I'm constantly having to explain myself to him, like I'm speaking a different language." Jessica settled back against the couch cushions, wine glass cradled in her hands, and prepared herself for another evening of helping Michelle work through her relationship issues while her own heart performed its familiar ache. She had become an expert at this particular form of emotional masochism, listening to the woman she loved dissect her relationships with men who would never deserve her. "Maybe you're just not compatible," Jessica suggested, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. She wanted to say so much more, wanted to point out that Michelle had been having the same conversations about Tyler for months, that she always seemed to be trying to force something that didn't come naturally, but that would require admitting things Jessica wasn't ready to admit, even to herself. Michelle was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in her glass and staring at it like it might hold answers to questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, more thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm even cut out for relationships. Like, maybe there's something wrong with me that I can never seem to make things work with anyone." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow, and she had to set her wine glass down to keep from gripping it too tightly. "There's nothing wrong with you," she said firmly, turning to face Michelle more fully. "You're incredible, Michelle. You're funny and smart and kind, and any guy would be lucky to have you. If Tyler can't see that, that's his problem, not yours." Michelle looked up at her then, something shifting in her expression that Jessica couldn't quite read. For a moment, the air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something that made Jessica's pulse quicken. Michelle's gaze dropped to Jessica's lips for just a fraction of a second before flicking back up to her eyes, and Jessica felt her breath catch. "You always know exactly what to say," Michelle murmured, and there was something in her voice that Jessica had never heard before, something that made her stomach flutter with dangerous hope. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility, until Michelle seemed to shake herself and reached for the takeout containers. "I brought Thai food," she said, and Jessica recognized the deflection for what it was, even as disappointment settled in her chest like a stone. "That place you like with the really good pad thai." They spent the rest of the evening eating takeout and watching romantic comedies that made Michelle roll her eyes and Jessica's heart ache with longing. Michelle curled up against Jessica's side somewhere around the second movie, her head resting on Jessica's shoulder, her hand resting casually on Jessica's thigh, in a way that felt both completely natural and absolutely torturous. Jessica found herself cataloging every point of contact, the weight of Michelle's head against her shoulder, the warmth of her palm through the fabric of Jessica's leggings, the way Michelle's hair smelled like vanilla and something uniquely her. She tried to focus on the movie, but her attention kept drifting to the woman beside her, to the steady rhythm of her breathing, to the way she laughed at the funny parts and made little sounds of disapproval at the dramatic ones. When the credits rolled on the third movie, Michelle was half asleep, her breathing deep and even against Jessica's neck. Jessica should have woken her, should have sent her home to her own bed, but she couldn't bring herself to disturb this perfect, torturous moment. Instead, she reached for the remote with her free hand and turned off the television, plunging the room into the soft darkness of late night. "Jessica?" Michelle's voice was sleepy, muffled against Jessica's shoulder. "Yeah. Can I ask you something?" Michelle shifted slightly, lifting her head to look at Jessica in the dim light filtering in from the street lamps outside. Jessica's heart began to race, though she couldn't have said why. "Of course." Michelle was quiet for so long that Jessica began to think she'd fallen back asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to kiss a woman?" The question hit Jessica like a lightning bolt, stealing her breath and making her entire body go rigid with shock. She stared at Michelle in the darkness, searching her face for any clue about where this was coming from, what it meant, whether it was safe to hope. "I mean," Michelle continued quickly, apparently taking Jessica's silence for judgment, "not in a gay way or anything, just like curiosity. Like, what would it be different? Would it be softer? Would it feel more natural?" She laughed, but it sounded forced, nervous. God, that sounds so stupid when I say it out loud. Jessica's mind was reeling, trying to process the question and all its implications while her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought about lying, about deflecting with humor, or changing the subject entirely. But something in Michelle's voice, in the way she'd asked the question like it had been weighing on her mind for a while, made Jessica choose honesty instead. "Sometimes," she admitted quietly. "I think most people do, don't they? Wonder about things they haven't experienced?" Michelle nodded, seeming relieved that Jessica hadn't reacted with shock or disgust. "Exactly. It's just curiosity, right? Like wondering what it would be like to live in a different city or have a different job." But even as she agreed, Jessica knew it wasn't the same thing at all. Her curiosity about kissing women wasn't abstract or hypothetical. It was specific, focused, centered entirely on the woman currently curled up against her side. She had wondered what it would be like to kiss Michelle approximately 1,000 times, had imagined it in vivid detail during sleepless nights and distracted moments throughout her days. "Have you ever thought about it with someone specific?" Jessica asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. "Or just in general?" Michelle was quiet again, and Jessica could feel the tension in her body, the way she seemed to be weighing her words carefully. "Sometimes specific," she finally admitted. "Like, sometimes I'll be talking to someone and I'll just wonder what it would be like, what they would taste like, how their lips would feel." Jessica's breath caught, and she had to resist the urge to ask the question that was burning in her throat. Instead, she forced herself to nod casually, as if they were discussing something as mundane as the weather. "I should probably go," Michelle said suddenly, sitting up and breaking the spell that had settled over them. "It's late, and I have that early meeting tomorrow." Jessica nodded, though every part of her wanted to ask Michelle to stay, to continue this conversation that felt like it was leading somewhere important. Instead, she walked Michelle to the door, helped her gather her things, and watched her disappear into the night with a casual goodbye that felt anything but casual. That night, Jessica lay awake staring at the ceiling and replaying every word of their conversation, analyzing Michelle's tone and body language for clues about what it all meant. She thought about the way Michelle had looked at her when she'd asked the question, the way her voice had sounded when she'd admitted to thinking about specific people. She wondered if she was reading too much into things, if her own feelings were coloring her interpretation of Michelle's words. But something had shifted between them that night. Some invisible line had been crossed, and Jessica could feel it in the days that followed. Michelle started texting her more often, showing up at her apartment with increasing frequency, finding excuses to touch her in ways that felt different from their usual casual contact. She would let her hand linger when she passed Jessica a cup of coffee, would sit closer during their movie nights, would find reasons to brush Jessica's hair back from her face or adjust her collar. Jessica began to notice things she'd never paid attention to before, or perhaps had been too afraid to acknowledge. The way Michelle's gaze would sometimes drop to her lips during conversation, the way she would lean in closer when Jessica was talking, as if she didn't want to miss a single word, the way she seemed to light up whenever Jessica walked into a room, as if Jessica's presence made everything better. 2 weeks after the wine and Thai food night, Michelle showed up at Jessica's apartment looking different somehow, more put together than usual, but also more nervous. She was wearing a dress Jessica had never seen before, something that hugged her curves in all the right ways and made Jessica's mouth go dry with want. "You look nice," Jessica said as she let Michelle in, trying to keep her voice casual despite the way her pulse had quickened at the sight of her friend. "Hot date." Michelle's laugh sounded forced, and she avoided Jessica's eyes as she made her way to the living room. "Something like that. Tyler's taking me to some fancy restaurant downtown. Apparently he wants to make things right between us." Jessica felt her heart sink, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "That's good, right? I mean, if that's what you want." "Yeah," Michelle said, but she didn't sound convinced. "It's what I should want anyway." She turned to look at Jessica then, something desperate in her eyes that made Jessica take a step closer without thinking. "Can I ask you something else? Something that might sound weird?" Jessica nodded, not trusting her voice. "When you're with someone you really care about, someone you could see yourself loving, what does it feel like?" Michelle's words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for a long time. "Like, physically. What does it feel like when they touch you or kiss you?" The question caught Jessica off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have given the direction their conversations had been taking lately. She thought about how to answer honestly without revealing too much, without admitting that she'd never felt that kind of connection with any of the men she'd dated, because she'd been too busy being in love with Michelle to give anyone else a real chance. "It should feel right," Jessica said carefully. "Like everything clicking into place, like you've been holding your breath without realizing it and suddenly you can breathe again." She paused, studying Michelle's face. "Why do you ask?" Michelle bit her lower lip, a gesture that Jessica had always found endearing but now seemed almost deliberately distracting. "I don't think I've ever felt that. Not with Tyler, not with any of the guys I've dated. I keep thinking there must be something wrong with me, that I'm broken somehow." "You're not broken," Jessica said firmly, moving closer until she was standing directly in front of Michelle. "Maybe you just haven't found the right person yet." "But what if the right person isn't what I expected?" Michelle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if everything I thought I knew about myself was wrong?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication, and Jessica felt her heart begin to race. She searched Michelle's face, looking for confirmation of what she thought she was hearing, but before she could respond, Michelle's phone buzzed with a text message. Michelle glanced at her phone and sighed. "Tyler's here. I should go." Jessica nodded, though every instinct she had was screaming at her to ask Michelle to stay, to continue this conversation that felt like it was building towards something important. Instead, she walked Michelle to the door and watched her leave for her date with Tyler, her heart heavy with unspoken words and missed opportunities. The next morning, Jessica woke to find a text from Michelle sent at 2 a.m. "Can't sleep. Keep thinking about our conversation. Can we talk tomorrow?" Jessica stared at the message for a long time, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she tried to decipher its meaning. She typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on something simple. "Of course. Come over whenever you want." Michelle arrived at Jessica's apartment that afternoon looking like she hadn't slept much, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and her eyes slightly red-rimmed. She was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, more casual than Jessica had seen her in weeks, and there was something vulnerable about her appearance that made Jessica's chest tighten with concern. "How was your date?" Jessica asked as she let Michelle in, though she could already tell from her friend's expression that it hadn't gone well. "It was fine," Michelle said, which Jessica knew was Michelle speak for, "It was terrible, but I don't want to admit it. He took me to this really nice restaurant, said all the right things, was the perfect gentleman." She paused, settling onto Jessica's couch with a sigh. "And I felt absolutely nothing. Less than nothing, actually. I felt like I was watching someone else's life, like I was playing a role in a movie I didn't want to be in." Jessica sat down beside her, close enough to offer comfort but not so close as to make things awkward. "I'm sorry. That sounds frustrating." "The thing is," Michelle continued, staring at her hands in her lap, "I kept thinking about what you said yesterday about finding the right person and everything clicking into place. And I realized that I have felt that way before, just not with any of the guys I've dated. Jessica's breath caught, and she felt her heart begin to race. What do you mean? Michelle looked up at her then, and Jessica saw something in her eyes that made her stomach flutter with dangerous hope. I mean that I feel more connected to you during one of our movie nights than I ever have during any romantic dinner with a boyfriend. I mean that when you touch me, even just casually, I feel more alive than I do when Tyler kisses me. The admission hung between them like a live wire, crackling with electricity and possibility. Jessica stared at Michelle, searching her face for any sign that she was misinterpreting what she was hearing, but Michelle's expression was serious, almost desperate. "Michelle," Jessica whispered, her voice cracking on the name. "I know how it sounds," Michelle said quickly, as if she was afraid Jessica might interrupt or run away. "I know it's crazy and confusing, and probably not what you want to hear from your friend who's supposed to be straight and dating your old college buddy, but I can't stop thinking about it. About you, about the way you make me feel." Jessica felt like the world was tilting on its axis, like everything she thought she knew about her life was suddenly being rewritten. She had dreamed of this moment, had imagined it in 1,000 different ways, but she had never quite believed it would actually happen. "How long?" Jessica asked, echoing the question Michelle had asked her just hours earlier. "How long have you been feeling this way?" Michelle was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider her answer carefully. "I think part of me has always felt it, but I didn't know how to name it. I thought it was just really intense friendship, you know? The way you're supposed to feel about your best friend." She paused, running a hand through her hair. "But lately, especially since that night we talked about kissing women, I can't pretend it's just friendship anymore." Jessica felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Michelle was telling her. "What does this mean?" she asked softly. "What do you want it to mean?" "I don't know," Michelle admitted, and Jessica could hear the fear in her voice alongside the hope. "I've never done this before, never felt this way about a woman. I don't know how to navigate it or what comes next. All I know is that I can't keep pretending these feelings don't exist." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them processing the weight of Michelle's confession. Jessica felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump into something that would change everything, and the terror was almost as overwhelming as the joy. "I need to tell you something," Jessica said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Michelle nodded, her eyes never leaving Jessica's face. "I'm in love with you," Jessica said, the words falling from her lips like a prayer she'd been holding back for years. "I have been for 2 years and 4 months, since that night you showed up crying about your ex, and I realized I would do anything to make you smile again. Every piece of relationship advice I've given you has been torture, because all I wanted to do was tell you that you deserved better, that you deserved someone who would love you the way you deserve to be loved." Michelle's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to cup Jessica's face in her hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was terrified of losing you," Jessica admitted. "Because I thought it was better to have you as a friend than to risk everything for something that might not be real." "It's real," Michelle whispered, her thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall down Jessica's cheeks. "God, Jessica, it's so real it scares me. I look at you and I feel like I can finally breathe, like I've been suffocating my whole life without realizing it." The confession broke something open in Jessica's chest, years of careful control and hidden longing spilling out like water through a broken dam. She leaned into Michelle's touch, closing her eyes and letting herself feel the warmth of Michelle's palms against her skin, the gentle pressure of her thumbs wiping away tears. "What happens now?" Jessica asked, opening her eyes to find Michelle looking at her with an expression so tender it made her heart ache. "I don't know," Michelle said honestly. "I need to break up with Tyler, obviously. I need to figure out what this all means for me, for my understanding of myself. But I know I want to figure it out with you, if you'll let me." Jessica nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She thought about all the nights she'd spent imagining this moment, all the scenarios she'd played out in her head, but none of them had prepared her for the reality of it, for the overwhelming mix of joy and terror and relief that was coursing through her veins. "Can I ask you something?" Michelle said softly, her hands still framing Jessica's face. Anything. That night when I asked you about kissing women, were you thinking about me? Jessica felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to meet Michelle's gaze. Yes, I was thinking about you. Michelle's breath hitched, and Jessica saw something shift in her expression, something that made her pulse quicken. I was thinking about you too, Michelle admitted. I've been thinking about kissing you for weeks, wondering what it would feel like, what you would taste like. The confession sent electricity shooting through Jessica's entire body, and she felt herself leaning closer without conscious thought. Michelle's eyes dropped to Jessica's lips, and Jessica could see the want there, the curiosity and desire that mirrored her own. Michelle? Jessica whispered, and it came out like a question, like a request for permission. I know we should probably take this slow, Michelle said, her voice breathless and uncertain. I know I should probably figure out my own feelings first, deal with Tyler, think about what this means for my life, but right now, all I can think about is how much I want to kiss you. Jessica felt her heart stop and start again, felt the world narrow down to this moment, this couch, this woman whose hands were still cupping her face like she was something precious and fragile. Then kiss me, she whispered. Michelle's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected Jessica to be so direct. But then her gaze dropped to Jessica's lips again, and Jessica could see the moment she made her decision. Michelle leaned in slowly, giving Jessica plenty of time to pull away, to change her mind, to decide this was too much too fast. But Jessica didn't pull away. Instead, she met Michelle halfway, their lips touching in a kiss that was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as they both realized that this was real, this was happening, this was everything they had both been wanting without quite knowing how to ask for it. Michelle's lips were softer than Jessica had imagined, and she tasted like the coffee they'd shared earlier, and something uniquely her. Jessica felt Michelle's hands slide from her face into her hair, felt her own hands come up to rest on Michelle's waist, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard, their foreheads resting together as they tried to process what had just happened. Jessica could see wonder in Michelle's eyes, and something that looked like relief, as if she'd been holding her breath for months and could finally exhale. Wow, Michelle whispered, and Jessica couldn't help but smile at the awe in her voice. Yeah, Jessica agreed, her own voice barely audible. Wow! They stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing each other's air and marveling at how right this felt, how natural. Jessica had kissed people before, had thought she understood what physical attraction felt like, but nothing had prepared her for this, for the way every nerve ending in her body seemed to be singing with joy. I should probably go talk to Tyler, Michelle said eventually, though she made no move to pull away from Jessica's embrace. Probably, Jessica agreed, though the thought of Michelle leaving, of this moment ending, made her stomach clench with anxiety. Are you going to be okay? Michelle nodded, though Jessica could see the nervousness in her eyes. It's going to be hard, and probably messy, but it's the right thing to do. I can't keep pretending to feel things I don't feel, not when I know what it's like to feel something real. Jessica squeezed Michelle's hands, trying to offer what comfort she could. I'll be here when you get back, if you want. We can talk about everything, figure out what comes next. I'd like that, Michelle said softly. I'd like that a lot. Michelle did leave then, but not before kissing Jessica one more time. A soft, lingering kiss that tasted like promises and new beginnings. Jessica watched her go with her heart full of hope and terror in equal measure, knowing that everything was about to change, and having no idea what that would look like. The conversation with Tyler went about as well as could be expected, which was to say it was awkward and painful, and involved a lot of shouting on his part and quiet explanations on Michelle's. He accused her of leading him on, of being confused, of going through some kind of phase that she would regret. Michelle listened to all of it with the patience of someone who had expected exactly this reaction, and when he finally stormed out of her apartment, she felt nothing but relief. She texted Jessica immediately. It's done. Can I come over? Jessica's response came back within seconds. Doors unlocked. I'm here. When Michelle arrived at Jessica's apartment for the second time that day, she looked exhausted but somehow lighter, as if she'd been carrying a weight she hadn't realized was there until she set it down. Jessica took one look at her and immediately pulled her into a hug, holding her close and letting her process everything that had happened. "How do you feel?" Jessica asked when they finally separated. "Free," Michelle said without hesitation, "scared and confused and completely out of my depth, but free." She paused, looking into Jessica's eyes. "And sure. For the first time in my life, I feel sure about something." "What are you sure about?" "You," Michelle said simply. "Us. This feeling between us that I've been trying to ignore for months. I don't know what it means for my future or how to navigate being with a woman or what people are going to think, but I know that what I feel for you is real and right and worth figuring out." Jessica felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes again, overwhelmed by the simple honesty of Michelle's words. She had spent so long believing that this moment would never come, that her feelings would always be one-sided, that she would spend the rest of her life loving Michelle from a distance. "I love you," Jessica said, the words coming easier the second time. "I love your laugh and your terrible taste in movies and the way you scrunch up your nose when you're thinking hard about something. I love how passionate you get about things you care about and how you always remember exactly how I like my coffee. I love that you're brave enough to question everything you thought you knew about yourself, and I love that you're here with me right now." Michelle's response was to kiss her again, deeper this time, with less hesitation and more certainty. Jessica could taste the difference, could feel how Michelle was letting herself sink into the kiss instead of holding part of herself back. When they broke apart, Michelle's eyes were bright with tears and something that looked like joy. "I love you too," Michelle whispered against Jessica's lips. "I don't know how I didn't realize it before, but I love you too." They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, about everything they had been too afraid to say before. Michelle told Jessica about the moment she had realized her feelings were more than friendship, about the weeks of confusion and self-doubt that had followed, about the way she had started comparing every interaction with Tyler to her interactions with Jessica and finding Tyler lacking every time. Jessica told Michelle about the night she had fallen in love with her, about the years of careful friendship that had followed, about all the times she had almost confessed and lost her nerve. She told her about the advice she had given that was really just her own wishful thinking, about the way she had learned to be content with crumbs of affection because she thought it was all she would ever get. As the night wore on, they found themselves curled up together on Jessica's couch, Michelle's head on Jessica's shoulder, their hands intertwined. It felt natural and right in a way that Jessica had never experienced before, like they were two pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their proper places. "What happens now?" Michelle asked, echoing Jessica's question from earlier. "I don't know," Jessica admitted. "I've never done this before either, not really. But I know I want to try, if you do. I want to take it slow and figure it out together and see where this goes." Michelle lifted her head to look at Jessica, and there was something soft and vulnerable in her expression that made Jessica's heart flutter. "I want that too. I want all of it, the good and the scary and the complicated. I want to learn how to be with you." They talked until the early hours of the morning, sharing fears and hopes and dreams for their future together. Michelle worried about what her family would think, about how to navigate a relationship with a woman when she had no experience or roadmap to follow. Jessica worried about whether Michelle's feelings were real or just a reaction to her dissatisfaction with Tyler, about whether she would change her mind when the novelty wore off. But underneath all the fears and uncertainties, there was a bedrock of certainty that neither of them could deny. They loved each other, had probably loved each other for longer than either of them had been willing to admit, and that love felt strong enough to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. When Michelle finally left that morning, it was with the promise to return that evening, and every evening after that if Jessica would have her. They were taking things slow. Michelle was still figuring out her sexuality. They both had a lot to learn about being in a relationship with each other, but they were doing it together. The weeks that followed were a revelation for both of them. They went on their first official date, dinner at a quiet restaurant where they could talk without interruption, and Jessica marveled at how different it felt to be with Michelle when they weren't pretending to be just friends. Michelle was more relaxed, more openly affectionate, more willing to let Jessica see all the sides of herself she had been hiding. They had their first fight, about something stupid and inconsequential that Jessica couldn't even remember afterward, but it was important because it proved that they could disagree and work through it and come out stronger on the other side. They had their first night together, not sex, but sleeping in the same bed, and Jessica woke up to find Michelle watching her with an expression so tender it took her breath away. "Good morning," Michelle whispered, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from Jessica's face. "Good morning," Jessica replied, leaning into the touch and marveling at how natural this felt, how right. "I love waking up next to you," Michelle said, and there was something shy in her voice that made Jessica's heart flutter. "I love it too," Jessica said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They established routines, small domestic rituals that made Jessica feel like they were building something real and lasting together. Michelle started keeping a toothbrush at Jessica's apartment, then a drawer of clothes, then half the closet. Jessica learned how Michelle liked her eggs in the morning, and that she was grumpy before her first cup of coffee, but sweet and talkative after her second. Michelle met Jessica's friends, the ones who had known about Jessica's feelings long before Jessica had been ready to admit them, and they welcomed her with open arms and barely concealed relief that Jessica was finally happy. Jessica met Michelle's family, a nerve-wracking experience that went better than either of them had expected, though there were still some relationships that would take time to repair. 3 months after their first kiss, Jessica woke up on a Saturday morning to find Michelle already awake beside her, propped up on one elbow and watching her sleep with that same tender expression that never failed to make Jessica's heart skip a beat. "What are you thinking about?" Jessica asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "You," Michelle said simply. "Us. How different my life is now compared to 6 months ago, and how I can't imagine going back to the way things were." Jessica reached up to cup Michelle's face, her thumb brushing across the cheekbone she had memorized through countless nights of falling asleep beside her. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" "Not for a second," Michelle said without hesitation.